Go converter nggak mas? Converter.
From this moment, I'm gonna going to my introduction first. It's such a very warm welcome and such a fantastic to see all of you guys here. Anyway, my name is Ken, and by day I'm just a student here in philosophy, faculty of philosophy. And for today, I'm gonna guiding our discussion for maybe 2 hours there, and in advance we share we should gonna take fairly 2 hours. And for us, all of you already know, we in our community we give our context that we feel we live with indigenous people, and our culture is filled with indigenous diversity. But in this context of philosophical field, especially in this academic notion, maybe we kind of find it difficult to put our state of mind inside theirs, that we call it indigenous, and that's why we gonna look forward to it on our knowledge system. So, but before we diving into our discussion, I'm gonna introduce our panelists. 3 panelists. Here is Professor Prasenjit Biswas, Min Song Kim, and Mas Rangga. Professor Prasenjit Biswas is known as a lecturer, and he works around ethnophilosophy, ethnicity, and indigenous identities. I read about his Wikipedia page last night, and that's all that I can find there. And for Min Song Kim, I heard about his journal, his work around latest journal is foundationalism, political, and such. And Mas Rangga itself, you all already know that he's a profound thinker in politics and Marxist. And anthropology. So that is all. But to navigate our flow for 2 hours, first, each of the panelists have approximately 20 minutes to share their thoughts and insights, and then we move into an interactive dialogues. And then lastly, we're gonna close it with a Q&A. So the first speaker, the first panelist is going to be Professor Prasenjit Biswas. He's gonna provide us with his foundational framework and how we going to understand this struggle in a broader scale. So, Professor Prasenjit Biswas, it's your time.
Good morning to everyone here. My gratitude to Rajamada Department of Philosophy and Religion, especially to Dr. Rodino and Moshua, and also I express my hearty thanks and gratitude to Professor Kim for coming forward to comment on this, and thanks to all of you this very good morning. So what I wanted to talk about is the idea of indigenous philosophy, which includes, indigenous practices of religion, indigenous worldviews, and indigenous cultural wars as such. And as you know that your country, Indonesia, has 17,000 archipelagos and islands, taken together, numbering 17,000 to 19,000. And each of the archipelago and island has its own native community, and each native community has its own belief system, its own worldview, its own rituals, gods and goddesses, and its own conceptualization about spirits of various kinds. So you have distinctive spirit worlds, distinctive worlds of faith in each of these archipelagos, each of these islands. But unfortunately, the mainstream discussion on understanding of faith and religion doesn't include the spirit world of the archipelagos. It doesn't include the specific rituals of various islands. It rather brushes all these aside in terms of a certain kind of voodooism, in terms of certain kinds of obscurantism, as if obscurantism is the mainstay of practice in these islands and archipelagos. That's a kind of a top-down approach which is undertaken by a number of Western epistemologists and epistemological schemes. I want to present a critique of all these epistemological schemes. So the first slide is about hermeneutic term in philosophical anthropology. There is a distinction for all of you. Anthropology is a study of a particular culture from an insider's point of view, while philosophical anthropology is to understand the philosophical framework, is to understand the epistemological framework, is to analyze the kind of language and the meaning structures that are there in a particular indigenous society, or in a particular archipelago, or in a particular island, or any such particular location, which gives birth to a distinct epistemology that comes under a philosophical framework, and we call it philosophical anthropology. Philosophical anthropology is something like transgenic and transspecies. There at the top, I need to expand on this, but I'll quickly pass on this slide. No, let's keep that slide. It's something transgenic. We understand the connection between one community and another community in archipelagos and islands in terms of genetic transmission at this moment. But philosophical anthropology adopts a point of view that looks at belief structures not in terms of its genetic constitution, that is constitution of genes or constitution of some biological lineage materials, but in terms of how it emerged into a distinctive pattern of belief or practices. And this has nothing to do with the genetic kind of understanding that happens in anthropology. In philosophical anthropology, it doesn't go by genetics. It also doesn't go by species. There are various species of animals and insects and other flora and fauna. Now these species or speciation actually influences human belief structure. But philosophical anthropology doesn't go by various species of flora and fauna that are available. What it goes by is something very important. It's a kind of a subterranean network of linguistic, ethnic and cultural complexes that are available. I give this example of the migration of people from Southeast Asia to Himalayas and sub-Himalayan region of northeast of India, where we have this Shan, Ahom, Naga, Zhou people. They are branching out from the same lineage of the Western Shan people and spreading across the sub-Himalayan region of northeastern India, which spreads roughly from Tibet to Nepal to the Bhutan and down below to the northeast of India. So that's a kind of a trajectory or a landscape where a migration of Southeast Asian peoples have happened. And this anthropologist called James C. Scott called these migrating people as Jomias. Jomias is a kind of a generic name that he gave to migrating people of the Southeast Asia who migrated from Mekong to Irrawaddy to the Himalayas in a crisscross manner across 2,000 to 3,000 years roughly. And they are settled in the hills of South Asia, originating from Southeast Asia and also from southwestern part of China. Okay, so that's a kind of a trajectory that is trans-species, transgenic, and that gives us the field for doing philosophical anthropology. Let's go to the next slide. Now, for doing this kind of an understanding of the spread of the ethnic communities, we need to take help of what we call as hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is this science and art of interpretation. And in interpreting indigenous faith, what is primarily important is my first comment. Religiosity arises from the unrepresentable in life that finds its best possible expression in an absolute beyond the living. So you have something that cannot be represented in terms of your knowledge and belief systems. And this impossibility of representing an experience within belief and knowledge gives rise to religion that takes you beyond the way you live, the way one conceptualizes the life around. So this absolute is something other and more than itself, hermeneutically formed as a horizon of autoimmunity. So the other, which is unrepresentable, actually creates a boundary for one's belief and knowledge systems. As if at the boundary of the knowledge and the belief system, you have those unrepresented or unrepresentable, and that unrepresentable is called as the other, something that is totally other, but which is at the boundary of your faith. And being at the boundary of your faith, it tries to regulate the inside elements of your culture in a manner that it can relate itself to the other, which is lying at the boundary. And this is something like a kind of an autoimmunity, a kind of an immunity, which is created by itself for a certain culture or a system of faith. A system of faith or a culture in archipelagos, in islands, they create a kind of an immunosphere for themselves. It's a kind of an immunity system which allows it to keep the unrepresentable outside, but by keeping the unrepresentable outside, it produces a faith of its own in a manner that it can relate to the other all the time by way of interpreting its own world in relation to the other. So, one of the thinkers and an important philosopher, Derrida, conceptualized religion as such, as a double bind of sacrifice and sacrifice of sacrifice. So religion operates through the logic of sacrifice. It sacrifices the other in the first place. And then it sacrifices this very act of sacrifice by creating a sphere of its own, by immunizing itself from the other, while it relates itself to the other on the other side of the boundary. So that's a kind of a complex hermeneutic process that we engage ourselves with in our philosophical anthropological reading. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So one of the examples which I want to give from the Balinese and Borneo society is that there is a widespread belief that the dead can be brought back from the spirit world and can be reinstituted in your homestead. And you can have a dialogue with the dead. You can continually worship an ancestor who had passed away, but who can be brought back. The return of the dead to the world of the living is the kind of a faith, is a kind of a practice that Balinese people and also people in Borneo, they practice, especially in the context of Dayak land, which is an example that I would like to give later on. So this is a kind of a relationality with another. The ancestor who is no longer existing is another. The ancestor who is dead is another. But you recall the ancestor, you call the ancestor back to your own lived world. And that calling back itself is an act of interpreting a certain relationship with the ancestor. And that relationship is not just with a particular ancestor, but that relationship is with all the surrounding beings. The surrounding beings who are connected to the ancestor are also called back, and they together produce a landscape or a humanscape of lived spirits and the spirits that are bygone. All of them return together back to their home. Okay. So this is a kind of an anthropological exercise or a philosophical exercise that happens within the community. Now we'll skip one slide, next one, traces of Nusantara. Yeah. So Borneo longhouses lived in by leading couple, Lundmeror, Lundutu, along with distant relatives in the corner, implying parental line of descent that reveals to present generation the norms of family life. Such long houses are inhabited by those people who are named after their parents, who arose from the river Kelapang and Mother Kelapang tributaries like Deet River. The legend of Tukadrini in the Calabat Highlands gets connected to cultivation of rice varieties as their sustenance. The supreme spirit, Deraye, is prayed and propitiated for good harvest. And now after Christianity, they pray for Lalud, meaning more strength, through Jesus Christ. The forest in Borneo remains abode of Ada, or spirits. Such spirits are visible only to Dayong, the shamans, who can interact with spirit reality or others. Now Nusantara includes all such islandic, archipelagic and highland spirits, whose immutable presence traverses across the space and makes itself immanent to its idealization by religious texts. So you have this legend of Tukadrini that idealize the water spirits, the highland spirits, and the harvest spirits, each assigned a certain kind of a function within the legend of Tukadrini in Borneo in terms of a relation between the living human being and those spirits. How those spirits affect the relation, the present life, the kind of practices of harvesting or any other such practices. They are all impacted by those spirits in terms of the faith or the belief that Borneo people have. Now, next slide. Archipelagic religions. About archipelagic religions, there is this J. Poo, the second one, 2021, he gave a theory that it's a kind of a relational entanglement and also a disentanglement in the context of indigenous, shamanic and animistic intelligence. The indigenous people are guided by something like animistic intelligence. They can locate that in every object, in every living or non-living, every visible or invisible being or the thing, there is a spirit. How do they know the spirit? This spirit, the existence of the spirit can be known by something called animistic intelligence. Or it can be known through what is also called as shamanic intelligence. That's different from artificial intelligence or general intelligence. It's a culturally cultivated kind of intelligence that can produce a meaning which cannot be seen from outside by someone else who doesn't cultivate that kind of animistic intelligence in him or her. So that's a very specific kind of idea of intelligence that arises from archipelagic religions. Such forms of intelligence, the next point, evolved into its own specific enactments. It is enacted in a specific way. Now, there is an example of this Dayak land, Dayak headhunters, they kill their own king, Dayak headhunters kill their own king. Why? Because they thought the king has a higher spirit, and therefore killing the king would enable or will create a greater capability among the community, because the spirit of the dead king can be imbibed and embodied by the community, the Dayak community. And there's this example of killing of the king. The king was known as Raja of Sarawak, and Raja of Sarawak was killed by the Dayak headhunters. In the legend of Tukadni Rini, Deraya inhabits Puruk Panuk Liang, where all is vast underground, and the spirit god Lemonid Langit is part of an mystic intelligence that the cosmos possesses. So here is another example of underground spirit, and the spirit is called Purut Panuk Layang. Purut Panuk Layang is this underground spirit that washes away all that is available on the earth, on the surface of the earth. And that's a kind of a transformation of the earth itself by washing it by the underground spirits. Okay. The next larger point that I want to make is that there's something called butinage, and butinage is something that is present in the Indonesian context. Butinage is crossing over from one religion to the another religion. In my own field work in Bali area, I had seen that Muslims are worshipping a Hindu god. A Hindu god is crowned with some of the characteristics of Allah as well as Jesus Christ, and it's idolized in a manner that combines some select aspects of the Hindu faith, also combined with some select aspects of some characteristics of Allah, combined with some characteristics of Jesus Christ, and the god is worshipped by all the religious communities like Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. It's a kind of a crossover from one religion to the other religion, which is called as butinage. And Nusantara religious practices are marked by a certain kind of a crossover, a certain kind of a syncretism, so that the specific boundaries of religions are somewhat soft, and there is a movement inside and outside of this boundary. Such butiners dominate islandic religiosity. For example, foraging and fluid religious identity among butiners of Java and Bali Islands finds multi-religious dynamic in a combined syncretic form of animism in Hindu, Islam, Buddhist, and Christian religion. And this is a complex hermeneutic process. This is a complex hermeneutic process, of combining the phenomenological spirit experience, a kind of a calculus or calculation about how the spirits exist. These spirits are interdependent, and it's a kind of an ontological calculus. And there is an aesthetic judgment about the spirits, how these spirits can come together to create a sense of beauty and goodness among the worshippers. Okay. Now all these practices are not something that exists totally on its own, which has no repercussions and parallels in other places. In places like Himalayan ecosystem, you have this spirit called Saib Lujman. Saib Lujman. You can go to the next slide. Himalayan. The first sentence, Saib Lujman, or Kojung Koja, or the Mizo concept of Plau Hainior, or Khasi concept of Karinyo, etc. These concepts. Is this chart Okay, just to save time. So we have these spirits, and these spirits are about counting the ribs of the hills. How many ribs, how many bones the hills have is counted in terms of the knowledge of the presence of these spirits, such as Kojung Koja, Sai Bloomgem, and in the South Asian context you have Flow My Hero and Kasi Concept Ka Rinkyo, which is also available in Cambodia. Ka Rinkyo is available in Cambodia, in Myanmar, among certain communities. So you can have this idea of counting how a hill is constituted, as if the hill is constituted by bones, as if it has an anatomy, and you count, you can see the anatomy of the hill by knowing the spirit Sai Bloomgem or Kajum Koja or the other two spirits. Now, there are many more such notions that describe personhood by turning things into beings and make communities partake in the rumble of the stone, in the wind of the mountain, and in the crying rain of the sky, in more than human ways. Okay. So there are many ways in which indigenous communities take part in natural phenomenon, and they become part of the natural phenomenon. If there is a rain is not something external to the community. The community is part and parcel of the process of raining. The community lives in the hills and they are part and parcel of the hills. So there is a kind of an unity or an identity that is produced between the community and the nature as such. And the nature of this identity is what we need to interpret and we need to understand. Now this is understood, next slide, in terms of some idea of the sacred, and it is the idea of indigenous sacred in the Himalayas. Mamang Dai is a writer and she writes prolifically. She says, we have long journeys in our blood, remembering the whole migration, starting from southwest China to the Himalayas. We descend from solitudes and miracles that conceptualize a certain kind of whispering sound of words spoken by unknown spirits in one's voice that pervades a shamanic symbolism. Now the second part of this symbolism is that Susie Gablik, another anthropologist, she talks about how natural phenomena and natural objects are attributed human faculties. Natural objects are attributed human faculties. Natural phenomena are attributed human faculties. And this is a kind of a transhuman perspective. It's not really, when you attribute human faculties to the non-human, it becomes something that transcends the limits of human senses. It becomes a transhuman perspective. Okay. Stories of speaking frog, transformation of human to hornbill soul, transformation of human to hornbill soul, living or entering body, that presents an impossibility of mind or body or self attaining nature in terms of presentation of ideas. So you have these ideas of transformation of the human body into a bird called hornbill, or humans transforming themselves into tigers, which is a shamanic practice, and this practice is such of being a tiger. The transformation of humans into a tiger itself is an all-encompassing transformation, where you cannot separate between the idea of a tiger and being tiger after being transformed from being human. So that's a kind of an idea of sacredness. Now this idea of sacredness needs an interpretation, and we can interpret it in terms of belief-related tokens or terms. We have large number of belief-related tokens or terms. These terms are indicating the possibility of actualization of a certain belief connotation or a belief term. But it is not the case that the actualization is always understood and immediately known. The actualization follows a process of participation in a process of actualizing a spirit token which requires a kind of a practice or a kind of a cultivation. And this practice or the cultivation is available in a variety of tribes and communities, in archipelagos across the Bay of Indonesia, going up to east of Africa. You have this large number of communities who are taking part into rituals continually, so that they can know about the presence of the spirits. And same thing obtains in the Himalayas, in the southwest of China, and it obtains through their stories and the way they conceptualize their spirits. Next slide, which is talking about, no, next one. Yeah, sure. And this is the slide where I want to say one point. You can see from the last third point, only on the occasion of death, such a self travels across thresholds and goes on to land of death that lies beyond the bounds of the immediate sacred boundaries drawn by concrete hills and rocks. So the dead soul can move across the landscape. It can cross the hills. It can cross the oceans. So it's not the case that, Nusantara, the difference between one island and the other island, that differential space is the space of transition. It's the space of transition of the soul from one boundary, crossing one boundary and entering into another terrain. It's not that they can be fixed by the landscape or the boundaries. Souls can traverse across boundaries, and this happens both in Nusantara and also in Himalayan context. The last slide. Application in ethnographic terms. As I began by saying that this kind of a migration that has happened from southwest China to the Himalayas is named by anthropologist James Scott as zomias, and this is further conceptualized by Chicago anthropologist Richard A. O'Connor. He talks about ethnic succession. When communities migrate through their spirits, through their soul, the successive process of migration yields into the next kind of ethnic community that is formed out of this migration. And this is what can be called as a kind of an ethnic succession. Now all these examples point us to the fact that a particular philosophical outlook by which we try to draw distinctions between various kinds of beings and entities may not be good enough to understand the spirit worlds, the world of transition of soul from one kind of boundary to another kind of boundary. For that you need a different kind of a philosophical exercise entirely, which we need to begin in terms of learning about Nusantara, in terms of understanding how souls migrate across Himalayas and draw the parallels between Nusantara and the Himalayas, which needs to be drawn, and I am here to draw such a concrete parallel. It's not just about publishing a paper, but it's about continuing with the research project, if you like, to draw this parallel between Nusantara and Himalayas, which is still an ongoing task that we are undertaking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Biswas, for your additional framework on our theme and discussion today. So, if I could say that this horizon is somehow made understanding that our interpretation built in a historical and context. So, this is gonna make our stepstone for the next speaker is Nusantara.
Okay. Right. Thank you again for this time. Actually, I'm student here, right? Beside me is professor and then also the lecturer one. Okay. First of all, thank you for Rodinat having me here. It is being honored. I guess this looks like academia farewell, right? because tomorrow I would like to be as a student as well as you guys here. So before I go, I would like to explain a little bit about my experience learning about philosophy, especially in this faculty. Our beloved faculty of philosophy, Fakultas Filsafat, Universitas Gadjah Mada. So I just try to make a bridge between the idea from the Himalayan philosophy paradigms from the Professor Biswas, and then maybe Nusantara would like to add more philosophical foundations about it. And I would like to starting from my experience during studying philosophy in faculty of philosophy. One of the idea I would like to talk is about the Nusantara philosophy. But because I would like to expand the idea of Nusantara philosophy in my one of the expertise, I call it looks like geophilosophy. In the geophilosophy, we also talk about the idea of the end of the world, the possible world that may be to ending all of the subject in the term of philosophical ideas. So I think that Nusantara philosophy also need to answer this question. Not only talk about the past, not only trying to romanticizing the culture, the myth, the legends, and everything in the past, but also need to encourage talk about the future. So now I'm challenging the idea of Nusantara philosophy after the end of the world, right? And then it is not attacking my personal, so don't be sensitive, right? We are the same as a student, right? So I just put the idea that probably Nusantara philosophy is still need to explore more and more. So my question is, it is about the premature regress or progress in philosophical imaginations about Nusantara philosophy. So yeah, let's go. Okay, this one. When I ask to my student what is philosophy, some of my students is referring to the dunya Sophie, right? Sophie word. And some students also talk about what is philosophy by Deleuze and what and they think that philosophy is talk about the abstractions, the abstract idea that maybe we can understand how the world works, the ethics, the cut, and everything like that. And the second one, when I try to surprise on the social media internet, asking, what do you think about philosophy? Some of the netizens thinks that philosophy is philosophy terrace. That is, philosophy is always in the form of the terrace. Like, never try to go inside, try to open the door, seeing what happened in the philosophy discourse. Don't attacking to Henry Manakiri. And the last one, some people also think that Indonesian philosophy, or when we talk about philosophy in Indonesia, it is always related to the falsafah, or the living idea. For example, falsafah Jawa, falsafah Batak, Baduy, Sunda, I don't know exactly, but they always refer that philosophy in their idea is about the falsafah. Falsafah is refers to the wisdom. Everything that we talk about philosophy is always to wisdom in something. But today I would like to make one of the agreements that maybe when we talk about philosophy, it is not always talking about the wisdom itself. Right? Back then, what is Nusantara in your mind? So, in my mind, Nusantara is one of the map that is captured by NASA in the middle of the pandemic, right? So Nusantara in your mind, maybe Nusantara city in the middle of Kalimantan, right? So what's the meaning of Nusantara itself? And the second one is the map from the colonial era. Nusantara is in the Borneo, as well as that Professor Biswas said before. But now when we talk about Nusantara philosophy, it is always referring to the Java-centric ideas, right? All of Nusantara philosophy is always dominated by several scholars from the Japanese ideas. We talk about the exactly, but the Japanese philosophy is really dominant, especially after 19th to 17th, in the new modern era under Soeharto era. But I do not like to talk about the politics. So next. Now we have a Bandung conference. The idea that we have the same structure of feelings. In the Bandung conference, we have an idea that we are as one of the foundational idea of the non-blocks policy, geopolitics, and so on. But why that we agree in after Bandung conference, some of the philosophers, including this faculty, trying to make one of the national state philosophy that we call as well as Pancasila. Thanks to Professor Nusantara as a founding of this faculty, talking about the Pancasila as well as what the government needs at the time. We need Indonesian philosophy. We need Pancasila as well as our idea of maybe Mr. Soften of this state. But in some of the idea when I tried to search several journals talk about the Indonesian or maybe Nusantara philosophy, they try to compare with Japanese philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and Indian philosophy. In my mind, the arguments can be explained more by using some of the anthropological approach. It means that when we try to see or open several of the Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy books, they had a strong philosophical foundation because they believe the philosophy is more 1,000 years. But we are, as an Indonesian, we know philosophy formally in the beginning of 2000, after Revolution era. For the first time that Bambang Sudiarto published one book called like post-modernism books, right? And then after the 2000s, we know that philosophy in Indonesia having a super progress, I guess. Like today, we know about more analytical philosophy, continental, post-continental, like some people say also indigenous philosophy and so on. So when we think about Indonesian philosophy or Nusantara philosophy, maybe we can use the map from Filipino philosophy. In terms of geographical, social, political, and culture, Filipino philosophy can be as one of the examples. The one of the condition as well as the African philosophy. They have a same spirit. The real conditions, political conditions in the post-colonial era, as well as Indonesian philosophy in the term of this condition. But we talk about the Indonesian philosophy. But how about the Nusantara philosophy? It is still debatable, even though in after 2040, School of Philosophy Jakarta tried to offer one of the international symposium talk about the Indonesian philosophy. They had a debate between the definitions, but the uniquely that our faculty is accepting to find their own way to claim that Indonesian philosophy is Nusantara philosophy. But for the another universities, or maybe university, when we go to the Universitas Indonesia, they claim themselves that we don't have any Nusantara philosophy, we just stay on Indonesian philosophy because of the timeline. So when we talk about the Nusantara philosophy, it should be before the pre-independent day, 1945. Okay, so some of the research that I try to find on the internet, maybe on a Google Scholar, I find they claim the Nusantara philosophy is likely ethno-philosophy. But what is ethno-philosophy? It should philosophy can accepting all of the idea in the culture. Should Thomas Kuhn or Immanuel Kant having their idea about the ontological in Reok Monorogo or Revolution as their own utilitarian idea or somewhat. Is that make sense or not? I don't know exactly. But when we see the diagram on the emerging Filipino philosophy, it's same like us, influencing by religions, Christianity, Hindu, Buddhism, Islam, and the conditions of the space, the conditions of geographical, same like us. We have the archipelagics, many islands, the seas also, right? We can see also how many publications talk about the Nusantara or Indonesian philosophy. When you search on the internet, maybe Indonesian philosophy, Nusantara philosophy, you can see some of the terms talk about the kearifan lokal, local wisdoms. Nusantara, one of the Kutihere also made her own philosophy using monopunctuation and the phenomenological approach and talk about aku dan budaya or I as I myself and my cultures. This cannot be separate each other. And the last one is Ferry Hidayat. It is really good. I hope Pak Ferry here. One of independent philosopher, I could say, independent researcher who published one of sketsa sejarah or the sketch of a very brief introductions about the history of Indonesian philosophy, not Nusantara philosophy. It is quite difficult because until now we can still debating about it, when and where. When we refer to Nusantara philosophy, there is in Japanese kingdom, Mataram, Pasar, or in the middle of the Borneo where the claim of idea like today. The shifting, the ambiguity, the uncanny of the term is still puzzling us, right? To understand what is the nature of Nusantara philosophy. But thanks God we have a lot in this, right? Nusantara, something like that. A small space, the small rooms, 3 times 4 meters squares. It's trying to collecting everything, even though that you don't have idea about Nusantara philosophy, you can join that and trying to meditate, thinking about what is Nusantara philosophy. Yeah, I hope you can find it, guys. So we move to the meta philosophy. If we believe that Nusantara philosophy is possible to be contributing in global philosophy, we have to check again. Nusantara philosophy is philosophy or pseudo philosophy. So now we move to some of the idea. When we claim that we have progress on Nusantara philosophy, we can ask about the idea of the pittance, trying to understand some of philosophical progress if we have the trajectory of the idea of the thought, the history of the thought between the accumulation of the idea, debating of the idea. But the bad way of some of indigenous research in Indonesia, especially when they talk about Nusantara philosophy, they just they have the understand everything is pre-given, including of the culture itself. Everything about the culture is always evident of the value, and then we talk about the value is always in a good way. But it is very naive if you are as a philosopher. You have to make everything that you see in the critical way. You're not great. You're not Ustad or Kiai or Pendeta. And when we believe about the progress, we should have or increasing our understanding about Nusantara or Indonesian philosophy, right? Where is the progress? Where just we just read again in the past and we have a good idea of the Japanese behavior, diet ideas, some of the totemisms in some way. And at the same time, Nusantara philosophy or Indonesian philosophy also need to be compared. Some of the idea originally about philosophical arguments, counter-example, like me and myself. I try to make the counter-example because I really love Nusantara philosophy, right? And make all the distinctions. How did we try to compare between the Filipino philosophy and also Nusantara philosophy, right? And maybe it can be contributing on the progress of the Nusantara philosophy. Or maybe we argue that maybe this looks like the regress or the progress in Indonesian philosophy or Nusantara philosophy. Like Dietrich is always mocking about philosophy. Philosophy cannot really solve any problem. They always started in the same equation and also with the same infinite equations and also infinite answers. Like cannot answer about the indifference between the subjectivity and objectivity. But I just for myself, there's the philosophy. Or maybe when we aside about the idea of the no progress, it means that there is no success about the advance of the well-established idea of knowledge. And this one, I guess you need to read this book. Yes. If you want to develop the idea of the local wisdom, Nusantara philosophy, or Indonesian philosophy, you need to understand about the meta philosophy first. Right? One of the edited book by Yafeng San, examining philosophy itself. I try to add in this slide, you can see right. The two criteria of an ideal concept of philosophical progress. First, that they have also the comparative notions. Nusantara philosophy is typically talk about the pluralisms, pluralistic way, monistics, or maybe dualistic. Or maybe we have the claim, right? Monodualism. Why not? But why we do not try to explain it in the monocultural area? Or maybe an ideal concept of philosophical progress ought to help us to have a good understanding of history of philosophy of Nusantara, for example. So I try to criticize the term of philosophical community. Why we always take it for granted for Africans. And we can also make a science as a friend. We can make our research not only in the first order research, but also in the second order research. We can relate to the anthropological findings, data, right? We don't need to be same. You don't need to pride that, okay, I'm the philosophy, I'm as mother of science. But what you can do, you just say in the front of the advancing of science that you're as a mother of science, but you don't have any progress. Oh. Right. So we move to the main of my presentation, talk about the end of the world. How the Nusantara philosophy can answer about the end of the world. How that Nusantara philosophy can experiencing the condition of the end of the world by using one of examples on what? On the Anthropocene planetary practice maybe. I hope someday some of the Nusantara philosophers also can make something new. Talk about, oh yes, Nusantara philosophy can against climate catastrophe, can against capitalism, how there is shamanistic idea, can against capitalism by using like what is called the white or black magic, right? But I really appreciate when we read about the idea from De Castro, the Amazonians talking about that the river is alive as well as us as a human in the Amazonian community. They can grow the idea of the Amazonians' wisdom to against all of the forest destructions. But we cannot do. Because we just reclaim that our philosophy is based on the nature state and treated on by the Sila oriented. What? I don't know exactly. I'm just student. Alright. So this is the challenge, the future challenge on Nusantara philosophy, same well as Kriti Chakrabarty also making comparisons, the inspiration from the Indian, from the global soul idea that Chakrabarty also divided the world in between the planets and also the globals. Global is very human-centric orientations, so we know about the globalization, right? But the condition of the planetary is natural by design. The trajectory is indifference when we talk about the geologically speaking in the term of the big time geological way, geological effect. And the problem in the future is maybe how the Nusantara philosophy can interpret this condition. Okay, we had about the idea of what is called the predictions of weather. Yes, created by Solo calendar Java. Yes, the Pranato Wongso, we call it. But the issue on the Pranato Wongso, the Pranato Wongso had a 12 months. In the beginning, the idea of the Pranato Wongso trying to understand that how the relationship between the places, the farming, rice fields, and the weather based on the Japanese climatology, or maybe the Japanese wisdom. But when we are as a Nusantara researchers, we should try to make a comparisons that currently Pranato Wongso is aligning or not with our current climate situations today. When I met with the several of anthropologists and historians to talk about the Pranato Wongso, they said that everything is going to change. So Pranato Wongso should be revisited. So maybe in the next couple of years, maybe we can have like Pranato Wongso revisited editions. Because everything has changed. The weather, climate, and the socials change. The land also changed, affected by the chemicals. Pollution. So it should be revisited. We cannot really reclaim on the romanticizing of the past. This is the current contemporary debate on the end of the world philosophy. We all know, right? Timothy Burton, Castro, and sort of the catastrophic thinking, unbecoming humans. We were on extinction and so on and so on. But what we can do, imagine if Nusantara philosophy also has a formula to against their super anthropocentrism, super subjectivity, maybe we can make the same the idea of the end of the world philosophy. End of the world philosophy means that trying to ending all of the dominance, human exceptionalisms. Everything is centered, human at the center, because now we living in the near of the disaster. We have to think about the new recognition, as well as Professor Prisma said, the more than human world, as well as this state we could talk about the invisible to recognitions. What is invisible in our human-centric politics way? There is any non-humans unrecognizable in Nusantara philosophy. Why that we just think about the multiculturalities, never think about the multinationalities? We can claim that, oh yes, we have a lot of natural resources, we have many islands, but we just only focusing and reducing only on a merely the variation of the culture, but never reconsider about the nature itself. So, the ending of the world means like collapsing of the subject. Okay, this is the very terrifying, right? This is like the chamber, you know that? It's a small creature that some people believe created by the black magicians, Sumerians. But I really love the idea of the small or tiny creatures. This looks like a metaphor that the janitor, it is trying to transcend in the idea of a human as a fully humans. Maybe we can go to the second principle of Pancasila, right? Kemanusiaan, yeah. So what is the idea of humanity itself? So we can accept the idea of the extra-human or non-humans in the term of the philosophy or not. Why Nusantara and Indonesian philosophy is always glorifying the idea of being a civilized people, being civilized human. What is the civilized itself? civilized according to Western ideas, civilized according to our authoritarian and fascist government. Right. So, in a Western perspective, the collapse of the subject we can see on the sum of the science fictions, video games, pop cultures, movie, music, right? We know about the robots, but now we just follow, yes, we are going to generating the idea of the robot AI. All of our governments trying to make, yes, we know it's living in the AI era. We talk everything about the AI, but we cannot really understand what happens behind the AI. AI is still humanized or not? AI is dehumanized. And the idea of the alien races, we know, yang terasing, unseen, or maybe in the Bahasa Indonesia terms like goib, and the zombies. So Jacob is zombies maybe, but some people there is no brain. This is likely the philosophical experience than in the fact. And this is imaginary axis of New Jakarta. When you see about the imaginary axis of New Jakarta, I do not want to against Sultan. This is being recorded. But this is really cool, right? We're trying to make it as the intangible heritage for UNESCO, right? But when you see about the imaginary axis, why it's always imaginary? Because the imaginary axis is trying to decentering of subject, making a new line between the land, the mountain, the rapid, in the between, and also the south on the sea. So basically, I want to say, even though that the first Sultan who created this idea, I do not talk about the politicals of borders or politicals of lands, no, but today, this idea is always trying to promoting in each of the tourism area in Japan. So we have to support. One of the idea of the imaginary axis is talking about the preserving the waters. But ironically, we know have a lot of the hotels. We got the sense of the crisis of the waters. So where is this, the imaginary axis? It is only on the mind, on the practically on the root. Okay, I'm so sorry, stop about this. The other one, colorful subject. You know that? Recognize the Neo-Kiddos, the idea of the Queen of the Sea on the south. It's same as well as we know about the Thomas Hobbes talk about the Leviathans and the Lovecraftians, the Cthulhu scenes, according to Nusantara way. The same idea, but if you were as a Nusantara philosophy, you can exploit more about Neo-Kiddo, the idea that the sea is there are visions, the sea is unknown, but now it's changing, reversing because of the mapping by Google Earth. We know how much is of the place. Right. Yes, this is like the Death Stranding 2. It's more 2024 you have to play. Talking about the condition of the end of the world situations in between the dead and living lives. So the experiencing, imagine that you experiencing not in the afterlife, but in the between. The necropolitic, according to Vasily Mambit, that we know how that people who every day that they have to struggle because all our government and really trying to stolen some their oil, for example. So what is real in the Nusantara philosophy? This one. Some decision is always trying to glorifying eco-spirituality, sustainable wisdom. But we can make on our criticisms, as well as the idea from the Czech Party talk about the issues about habitability versus sustainability. Sustainability is very political because we are maybe we're from the poorer family, we can live easier, sustainable, but not habitable. Right? But for people who live in a super rich family, they can get both habitability, and also the sustainability. But now, our philosophicals in the term of Indonesian politics is always thinking about the sustainable development idea, but never think about the habitabilities ideas. So you can live everywhere even though that the place is so bad for you. What is my solution? My solution is quite simple. By using the geophilosophy, you can make Nusantara is always powerful. You can promoting the more global philosophy. And you can also inviting some of the islands studies, right? Critical island studies trying to explore more about the local wisdom is not only merely for nationalizing of wisdom passed on the Java centuries. And the third one is talk about the post-colonial identity. Every day we open the news, we always see about the polarization of identity, right? Left, right, Prabowo or Prabowo, anak apa. It's trying to make our part of the differentiations. But our condition is more volatile. The more complex way we consuming a lot of information, it is not only about the Indonesian. We have the idea to make sure that Palestine will be free, but at the same time we cannot really understand what happened in the surrounding of our family, for example. And the last one is you can use about the idea of the articulatic thinking as the republic basis, because we're living in the republics of Indonesia. I really love it. So you can use it. Thank you. And this one is Indonesia Mas or golden generation, and then you are looks like laughing about it. And now we have archipelagic evolution, right? From the silver, right? You can see some of people in the near crossroad. Oh, this is a silver. Maybe in 2045 we are changing to be the gold. So let's see what happened in 2045. But this is like the top 20. This is like the vision or motto from the government. Thank you for your attention.
Such a great breakdown from Mas Ranga, and that's somehow I feel it's necessary for our understanding of this field discussion itself. So moving from Mas Ranga, we got Min Song Kim. I'm sure that you already stack up your thoughts along the way, so this is your time, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here in the company of distinguished scholars, Professor Sanjay Biswas and Ranga Mahaswa, my friend and collaborator. In fact, we wrote a paper together about Nusantara philosophy. Some of it is actually here. Okay, but I must also admit that I feel like the old one out here of the street, because since I'm not able to offer empirically informed deep reflections on either intercultural research or indigenous ontologies beyond what I had previously said back in 2023 here and there about the state ideological capture of the Nusantara. This is why when I was formally invited by Odi to participate today, I agreed to do so on the condition that I won't be required to base my intervention on anything like a fully thought out paper. Hence, instead of advancing a specific thesis or argument, I want to offer a series of related observations on recent shifts in academic climate regarding indigenous ontologies, the way in which the objectives and questions of today's event had been articulated in the terms of reference letter for this event that I received from Odi, and also the inextricability of the political from the idea of indigeneity. So, around 2 years ago, I was in attendance at a conference in Thailand where one panel was dedicated to indigenous nature cultures in Indonesia. As the two presenters, whom I assume were students at an Indonesian university, presented the paper on the maritime indigenous people, suku Laut, of the Riau Islands delivered a talk. I thought that they were rather unnecessarily apologetic about how incredible and unfamiliar to the ears of the moderns the indigenous cosmology and they described might sound. However, in truth, viewing the audience at that conference, which was actually on posthumanism, would have needed to be pleaded to be receptive to the indigenous cosmology and non-modern practices of world-making the presenters described. Many in the audience would have had their dose of Donna Haraway and Isabel Stengers. In the academic context where it is accepted that life is universal but its modes are pluriversal, the pluriversalist idea, indigenous epistemologies need no external validation, especially not from the provincialized perspective of the audience. So I was reminded of the presentation on the cosmology of the suku Laut and what I had thought listening to it when I received the terms of reference outlining the background for this event and sort of key questions for discussion. Because it seems to me the very premise of the invisibility or underrepresentation of indigenous perspectives in academic discourses is no longer applicable, or at least no longer applicable in the same way as 10 or 15 years ago. Or today, as part of the broader movement towards planetary attribution thinking, anthropology, international relations, political theory, geography, and many other disciplines have been impacted by the so-called indigenous turn, or are under the influence of versions of ontological turn which often involve some kind of indigenous analytic. If there is one author who is particularly worth mentioning in relation to both of those two terms, indigenous and ontological terms, it would be the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Ribeiro de Castro, whom Wanda mentioned in fact, who brought Amerindian cosmology and practices of worlding or world-making characterized by what he termed perspectivism and multinaturalism into contact with the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari provide for Ribeiro de Castro, quote, the conceptual means for orienting us in a thought world as strange as Amazonia, end of quote. However, the primary purpose of the contact for Ribeiro de Castro is not to explicate Amazonian or Amerindian worlds, but to transform indigenous world-making into a speculative pragmatic, to use the term from Brian Masumi, potentially capable of reconfiguring our ways of thinking and doing things, including with regard to philosophy and its concepts. Once it is granted that indigenous thinking is able to effectuate, as the English translator of Ribeiro de Castro's book Cannibal Metaphysics puts it, the becoming Amazonia of Deleuze-Guattari in particular, and of philosophy more broadly, it seems no longer relevant to ask whether a given indigenous epistemology is, as the TOR letter I received says, is one of the key questions for this event, derivative or original, vis-a-vis an already known text. Rather, what becomes relevant is the capacity of indigenous thinking and acting to reconfigure and create concepts, which many theorists of the Anthropocene today argue can effect the transformations of our ways of living and thinking after the end of the modern world, which is the kind of approach it seems to me that Ranga is calling for in the Indonesian context. Now, given the shift in the academic climate of indigenous onto epistemology and the emergence of novel philosophical deployments of indigeneity in the past decade or so, I am inclined to say that if the invisibility, so-called invisibility of indigenous onto epistemology, or its failure to receive recognition continues to be a problem in the Indonesian context, it is as much a sociological problem as it is a problem of philosophy, or rather, I would actually say it's more sociological than philosophy and not a philosophical problem. Sociological, firstly, in the sense that the decades-long tendency to study Indonesian philosophy in a manner of what some people regard as a limited form of ethnophilosophy, again mentioned by Banga, continues on into the present. But also, in a related but slightly different sense that is hinted by observations from non-Indonesian scholars who have studied Balinese culture, which incidentally inspires the title of the Nusantara's book, A Thousand Petals. Namely, their observation that representations of Balinese culture at the hands of New Order era Indonesian scholars often approximate or regurgitate the state ideological discourse. In other words, Indonesian scholars writing about Bali back in the days of President Suharto used to place a great deal of balance on principles of harmony and balance that supposedly inhere in Balinese cultural practice and artifacts, even though traditional Balinese narratives, theater, and so on, often foreground conflict, power, and mastery. It is easy to imagine institutional inertia and ideological expectations as epistemic obstacles, as hindrances to faithful representation of indigenous knowledge. But it is also worth reiterating that the ideological capture of indigeneity in the form that happens today does not proceed solely by the repression of indigenous ontology, but also by its valorization. In their well-known paper, Decolonization is not a metaphor, Easthup and Kei-Wen Yang recounts an experience they had at a conference on the value of liberal arts education in the United States. There, they had suggested, at the conference, they had suggested that the true project of liberal arts education in America has historically been to make, quote, the settler indigenous to the land he occupies, end of quote. And they meant it as a critique of settler colonial erasure of indigenous knowledge. But this suggestion, the suggestion that the true project of liberal arts has been to make the settler indigenous to the land he occupies, was mistakenly received by their audience as implying that liberal arts education that teaches settlers to become indigenous is something, quote, admirable, worthwhile, and wholesome. The point intended by Tuck and Young was incommensurable with what the audience expected them to say when they evoked the idea of becoming indigenous. But as Tuck and Young proceeds to show, the readiness, desire even, of non-indigenous people to embrace or valorize indigeneity, hence to partake willingly in the process of becoming indigenous, does not necessarily translate into the political empowerment of the indigenous peoples themselves. Indeed, Tuck and Young are suspicious of certain forms of decolonization. We can think of talks of decolonizing the curriculum, for example, that they claim could easily be reduced to a settler colonial move to innocence, where, quote, conscientization comes to stand in for the more uncomfortable task of relinquishing stolen land, end of quote. Although the Indonesian situation is very different from that of the North American settler colonial states, it seems important to ask what exactly is being achieved when indigenous knowledge is articulated and represented within the Indonesian academic discourse. For even a label like Indonesian philosophy, when used in a way that encompasses indigenous epistemologies of the archipelago, is not entirely unproblematic, as it risks a representation of indigeneity filtered through the modern category of nation state. So it seems approaches to indigenous knowledge and epistemology are often ideologically conditioned. This naturally raises the question of whether there exists a proper, correct, non-distorted method of access to indigenous knowledge and epistemology that avoids the pitfalls of both undermining or repressing them and overmining or glorifying them, universalizing them in problematic ways. Very schematically, we might think of this as the question of differentiating what is properly indigenous and from what is not. But where and how do we draw the line? Let us suppose, in line with the commonly evoked difference between the world of modernist epistemology and the indigenous world. The distinction being that the modernist world is one in which mystical and spiritual beings are absent or unrecognized, whereas in the latter, in the indigenous world, those beings, spiritual, animate, non-human beings, are very much a part of reality. As Derrida suggests in the Status of Marx, Marx's account of the commodity fetish could be seen as a discovery that certain non-human objects, when in the midst of capitalist society, become animated or spiritualized, or to use a word made popular by new materialists, agentic. But Marx, ultimately bound by metaphysics of presence, i.e. the hallmark of Western modernist epistemology, found it necessary to exercise the spectral dimension of things, and thus to render the suprasensible sensuousness of objects a contradiction to be resolved. So, we should conclude that Marxism wants to do indigenous epistemology justice. That may turn out to be the case. It may turn out to be the case. But if we follow Derrida's own passage toward a general ontology, that is, the view that there is no being that is fully present to itself, that is fully self-identical, hence that every being is really spectral, then the very distinction we have presupposed between the modern world, consisting of disenchanted matter, and the spiritualized world of indigenous epistemology breaks down. Thus, we effectively end up with a lack of grounds based on which we may cleanly separate the indigenous from the non-indigenous. My hunch is that every attempt to determine the properly indigenous, a proper method, a proper representation, and so on, will return us to this situation of groundlessness. To be sure, this does not mean that indigeneity and indigenous epistemologies are without any determinateness or remain entirely elusive for us. But it does mean, I think, that every attempt to articulate them will be overdetermined by an irreducibly political dimension. When we talk about indigenous peoples, the idea of indigeneity tends to imply, quote, a bounded socio-territorial unity within which rules, norms, and ways of life are fundamentally different than that of the moderns, end of quote. But as the Indonesian anthropologist Geger Rianto has recently pointed out, such an idea, common today across Southeast Asia, is inseparable from the historical expansion of capitalism. For one, it can be argued that a certain conception of the inalienable relation between indigeneity and land was consolidated by restrictions on rural land rejection, either advocated by colonial scholars, including someone familiar to you, Cornelis van Vollenhoven and his school of Adat law, or implemented by paternalistic colonial administrators to protect, and I quote Rianto here, to protect rural segments of the colonized population from the perils of the market, believing it was their duty to keep the indigenous communities intact. Despite the somewhat sedentary presuppositions apropos of space, territory, and identity that may not neatly apply to indigenous worlds, this historically consolidated idea of indigeneity as a bounded socio-territorial unity within which rules, norms, and ways of life are fundamentally different than that of the moderns, nevertheless was taken up by the indigenous peoples of the Indonesian archipelago, constituting a basis for their struggles for greater autonomy in the 20th century and beyond, which some have termed Adat revivalism. So what I want to emphasize in the end is not that our representation of indigeneity is a product of modernity, but rather that the differencing of the indigenous from the non-indigenous is premised on the existence of a world on which that difference is inscribed, except that this world is self-dislocated. It is not one due to such things as capitalist expansion, statist enclosure, and interethnic conflicts. Taking a thought from political theorist Oliver Maher, it might be argued that the world in which indigeneity implicates itself is a world formed and deformed by antagonism. There is, because of this, not a neutral, objective, scientific position from which to reconstruct or represent indigenous epistemologies. For indigeneity is always already implicated in the political. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Big stuff By this, we know that somehow our representation of culture and everything is, in a way, make us somehow neglect the other that we maybe don't understand. So, from this presentation and ideas that they already delivered, is there anyone who have a question?
No. Oh, maybe.
I guess there's a three person.
Okay. Hello everyone. Thank you, President, for such an amazing presentation. A brief introduction about myself. I'm Nusantara, a recent graduate of anthropology from University of Sussex, but I was an alumni of Faculty of Philosophy, where I pursued my bachelor degree minor in Nusantara philosophy. So my question is, back in Sussex, I once broke up the concept of Babia from Batak Indigenous community, a way of understanding and relating to Sumatran culture, that which is embedded in local cosmologies and other practices. But when this kind of idea is brought into a global academic discourse, they often risk of being flattened into a categories of cultural beliefs, which I found this is not really enough to represent the depth of, how can I say this, like the depth of and the complexities of the local cosmologies itself. So my question is, in your view, how this intercultural hermeneutics could avoid of becoming another form of epistemic extraction, and what kind of methodological safeguard and also dialogical practices that can ensure this indigenous term can remain grounded in their own terms. So thank you very much.
I can give you kind of a tentative answer, because if you say that, you know, the intercultural hermeneutics is another mode of extraction of knowledge, you know, it's more than a mode of extraction, it's a mode of communication between boundaries that we have grown through our cultural practices. Now, growing up as a child in a certain culture doesn't necessarily entail or empower you to talk to another culture. How do you talk to the other culture? To talk to the other culture, you need to cultivate the categories of understanding that the other culture has produced. And that requires a kind of an epistemic commitment to the other culture. So once you are committed to learn about the other culture, you are ready to also establish certain bridges between your culture and the other culture by way of interpretation, by way of experiencing the other culture as well as your culture. So you will use multiple methods of establishing that bridge between your culture and the other culture. Now, in the context of Nusantara, the knowledge that you have of your own culture draws a kind of limit on your own senses, on your own visualization, or on your own capacity. How do you overcome this kind of the kind of blinds that are drawn from our own culture? That's the question. And to break these blinds and go towards the understanding of the other culture is something that will open up new ways of understanding culture. So this will be how we'll look at the situation.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think it's a really important one. So at the end of my brief intervention, I concluded that indigeneity is inextricably political, right? The implication is basically this. Look, I believe in the essential corruptibility of everything and everything, including hermeneutics, including philosophy. They can be mobilized for ends that are oppressive as well as emancipative, right? So the ultimately the answer to the question should be how the hermeneutics gets articulated with the invisibility. If it fails to connect support for that kind of logic, right? That's how it avoids it becoming another colonial logic.
Okay, thank you.
Move to the second question. Nggak bisa bahasa Inggris. Yeah, I'm about to throw a question for kakak mahasiswa gitu ya. But it might be trivial. So I don't really grasp why you use premature regress, the term of premature regress on your presentation title. Is it because it indicates that what we call Nusantara philosophy not have a strong enough methodological approach? But if we emphasize this on that aspect, what makes Nusantara philosophy different from regular cultural anthropological study? So, if there is no difference, then there is no regression. It should be there is no regression because philosophy Nusantara itself might be doesn't exist. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, it's fine when I answering while Azan. I don't know, but this is okay because you're in the philosophy, right? Okay, thank you very much, Kiki, for the questions. Why did I put the titles is about the regress and premature and the progress of philosophical imaginations. Because I think I have done to invite you as to rethinking again by using the title of the clickbait. But no, I do not want to talk about the clickbait of the title of presentation, no. I'm just trying to put the term of the premature because in the term of a philosophical community, we still have several debate about it. Some philosophers in Indonesia think that Nusantara philosophy is living wisdom, or maybe likely living philosophy. So they don't have any differentiations between everything who or whom indigenous people or maybe community live, and then they suddenly claim it as a part of Nusantara philosophy. But we don't have any consent, maybe, and trying to talk about them that, oh yes, this is your philosophy or not. No, this is not philosophy. And then I guess that your thesis look like the epistemic colonizer. You come from the somewhere, and then you claim that, oh, this is your philosophy. But exactly not. So my answer, it should be, when we think about the premature of Nusantara philosophy, why I always try to criticize again and again about Nusantara philosophy, because I'm not happy about the Nusantara philosophy. It just looks like that. I really love it. Right? Why we don't try to think that Nusantara philosophy should think with, not think of. Right? For example, thinking of Papuan's wisdom. Why we don't try to make thinking with Papuan people? Because the attributions of and with and for and from, it is quite different. The Nusantara philosopher is always tending to reclaim and claim again that everything that they investigate is precisely can be claimed as a part of Nusantara philosophy. Why I say that is still on the regress? Because I have the timeline in 2025. when our beloved faculty is always claiming that Nusantara philosophy is unique and special. Why we don't say that we have Indonesian philosophy? Why we always force our intellectual academia in philosophy, thinking about the Nusantara philosophy? So the premature means that I'm still trying to search again and again where and when Nusantara philosophy began. Right. So yeah, the example of the meta philosophy, yes, as you say, it is likely the trivial investigations, but why not? But when we make the framework likely in the Filipino philosophy, we can claim that we have our Indonesian philosophy. Or maybe the question is again, Indonesian people, or maybe Indonesian scholar, or maybe Indonesian academia who talk about philosophy, we can say there is Indonesian philosophy. Rocky Gerung Indonesian philosopher or not? Martin Suryajaya philosopher or not? So who can claim about philosophy as well in the term of institutionals on philosophy, right? So yeah, I think it is all for me. Thank you, Gigi, for your question. Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. So, so do you agree that there are a robust methodology, like very methodological approach, but what constrains Nusantara philosophy is philosophy itself is a political and presupposition that becomes a precision gitu. Like when we try to articulate Nusantara philosophy, we always articulate it with lima sila. Do you think
All right. Thank you for the questions. It is better when you give me about the specific article. Maybe we can try to deconstruct about the method. Okay, I really agree about the idea that Nusantara philosophy should has their own methodology, but I do not really fully agree about it. Why we don't use like the established philosophical methodology? We just read, we just collecting several good introduction to philosophy, or maybe as well as Deleuze try to talk about the philosophy as the concept, as the abstract. We can extracting some of the idea from our society or maybe culture to be as a philosophical sentence. But the problem of Nusantara philosophy is always reducing everything based on the culture. The culture, it means that every activities, politically, sociologically, for example. But there is very limited when we approach some of the thinkers. It is quite different. For example, Albert and I tried to explain about sex indigenous. When I tried to find some of the archive, I cannot find it. A reputable book or journal talk about the sex indigenous. So I find more about Islamic philosophy and also the Western philosophy called likely Spinoza, Leibniz, or maybe Al-Ghazali talk about the word, and then trying to comparing between the sex indigenous and also Spinoza. But there is very limited on the person's life as a philosopher. Why did I try to challenging on Nusantara philosophy? Because it is about the re-territorializations of the boundaries. Some of the people claim that Nusantara philosophy is from the south, maybe from the west of Indonesia. But some of the claims also think that everything happens in under Indonesia, we can claim as Nusantara philosophy. So yes, it is our problem today. We don't have enough or maybe robust methodology. So this is your time, this is your turn. Wahai mahasiswa filsafat, to making a new methodology to make sure that everything that you do is not transgressing to be an anthropological or ethnographic method. Or maybe you can read Niels Bohmann's philosophy in a film, which is the best book to understand how that the anthropology also can use philosophical way. Vice versa, we as a philosopher also can use more anthropological approach as well as Prof. Biswas explained to us before. Okay.
Yeah, you can.
Just to add to that, that the claim that there is no methodology itself is problematic, because you develop your own creative methodology. You go for a field work, you understand various conceptions, the way a particular subject is explaining to you. You record that, and then you conceptualize further on that, and that will lead you to a certain methodology. Methodologies are not readily produced, in this kind of doing philosophy on certain areas which are excluded from philosophy.
Can I agree? Yeah. I mean, I think I'm making this very similar point with Professor Biswas. But ultimately, I mean, okay, let's just think about like European philosophy or French philosophy, right? I mean, does French philosophy have a method? I mean, not really. Like, if you ask Deleuze and Badiou, they don't agree on the method and then differ only on the content of their findings. No, they are actually disagreeing about how to do philosophy. What is a really good philosophy? Right? If you look at Descartes and whoever, Kant, German philosophy, they're not agreeing on some philosophical method and then disagreeing about how to do it correctly. They are actually disputing fundamentally about what philosophy is and what method it is, right? That disagreement is constitutive of a vibrant philosophical culture. If you want Nusantara to really be a living philosophy, then stop thinking about identifying and fixing a single method, right?
So the answer is there is no methodology for Nusantara philosophy, which is fine, because Nusantara philosophy is methodology itself. No, it's still debatable. Okay, thank you. For the next question, maybe you have any other thought? Okay, Mas Odi and the behind one. Thinking.
Hi, my name is Wafi. I have a bit curiosity about Mas Rangga's take on how we do philosophical research as a first order research. I mean, pardon me if I misunderstood, but I catch that you said that there's something wrong with how we do philosophical research as first order research, and so we don't have to always do philosophy as a first order research. You can also do it as a second order research. And don't get me wrong, I love the idea of philosophy as a second order research. I did that myself with anthropology and art studies, but I would like to, why don't we revise how we do philosophical research as a first order research? I mean, I would like to know what is the possibilities of philosophical research as a first order research. I mean, okay, we can rely on empirical data, etc., but what can we do as a first order philosophy? Is there something wrong with how we do it? If there's something wrong, if there's something that makes philosophical research as a first order research is not sustained for the sustainability of philosophy. And I would like to know the response from Mr. Kim and Mr. Biswas as well, is there so? That's all, thank you.
Okay, well, I do not try to judge that every single Nusantara philosophy is always using the second order of research methodology, but I basically come from the research, and then if you have the time, you can with my paper talk about the questioning local wisdom in indigenous research in Indonesia. I try to use several like generative AI to search and collecting all of the thousands of predatory journals or maybe underprivileged journals, something that they claim as well as Nusantara philosophy or maybe local wisdom philosophy. The problem is they claim that everything that they make like the judgments about something in a specific of the area, maybe for example the cultures or maybe art for example. They do not make a real of the ethnography, but they claim as well as the empirical basis. Neither also they do not really make originals or maybe the continuity of the concept or the affections of something. Right. For example, it is quite limited examples. One of the paper talking about we can call the culture if and only if is suitable with the idea of Kunto Wijoyo, for example. The assuming that the culture has the one of the seven types of the culture. For example, one of it is they have all the religions or belief. How if we go to the indigenous peoples whom they do not want to claim that they have on religions? So we can call this as a culture or not. But the several research try to make it more simply. Yes, this is uncivilized culture who live in the peripherals of area of Indonesia. So that is why that I always encourage you to make philosophical approach carefully. Because somehow that philosopher in our academia community always trespassing everything. They can claim that, okay, we can make the abstractions or something of courage or maybe something like that. But they also never touch courage by themselves. It is problem of not known in a philosophical discourse. But the problem if we check their Google Scholar, how many people cite them, as well as the truth in the term of cultural area, or maybe something in the term of political way, right? So that is why I would have an imagination in the futures, maybe, for example, Pancasila philosophy, right? Having in the first order philosophy, for example, Rodinal also making some of experimental philosophy on the Pancasila. Maybe I as myself always talking and asking again and again why Pancasila is always adopting everything about the human-centric idea. Why do not we consider about the natures? So that is why we always distinguishing about the nature itself now, because in the relation of the five principles, we just make the idea of the simply the relationship with the first principle and about the God, and the 2 to the 5 is talking about the human and human again. So simply that why I try to challenge it is not as well as the general methodology, but I forget to mention again several papers that I got and received from my research about it. So the other problem is who gonna be as like available or maybe profound Nusantara expertise in Indonesia. We don't have, right? So I hope, yeah, Lavinus maybe being a one to be a professional peer review, to know that this is the good paper or not, to be published. Don't try to just romanticizing something or glorifying something, right? So, yeah, that is all for me. Maybe Prof. Biswas first, and then you.
I'll just add to what Ranga has said. But your question has a kind of a ground of suspicion. And the ground of suspicion is that whether we are relegating philosophy to something second order, that is bringing it under something else or not? Well, no. Sometimes we need to recover philosophy in a certain way. And in order to recover, you need to look at history, you need to look at culture, look at the ways of life, look at the belief systems and all that. And then when you bring them together in a kind of a non-hierarchical relation, let's say between what you have learned from history and what you have presently experienced from the lifestyle of a certain people, you bring them together on the same plane. And that's a great synthetic work that is done by a philosopher. And then you break the process of ordering. In fact, you create a totally different order by taking into account things that were not part of your order, and you are bringing them into an order while you are not able to define that order. You see? So there is no conditions of closure of a certain way of ordering. You know, if I put it in logical terms, you can't decide the conditions of closure. As you bring it together, you bring it from all sources, and these sources are open to you. You don't have to be constrained by taking an idea from a source. This entirely unrestricted, unconstrained collection of ideas which you bring together, cook them together, and prepare your meal of philosophy out of it. Okay? So it's not a first order, second order dichotomy anymore. Okay.
Okay, now, so for the last question, right? I'm so sorry again. Sorry. Your turn again.
Send your responses or
Oh, did it?
Okay, thank you very much for this was Ranga and King. Yeah. I think my first question is I want to give to Professor Biswas. This is the continuation of our previous discussion, I think, yeah, because you brought a bit or several Meronian camps or Meronian token into your presentations. Yeah. I just want to clarify what kind of heretical thinkings or heretical methodological heretics that you propose, yeah, regarding the way we handle the diversity of things related to Nusantara philosophy, for example, because we know that so many interpretandum, so many objects, so many texts, phenomenon, and so on, that not solely can be said that they are very, very concrete. Yeah. We also have, as Ranga Maswa mentions on his slides, that a lot of fictional things that, okay, stated as the foundations of the narration of Nusantara philosophy itself. Is it right, or do you agree that I said you propose some kind of like democratizing things, yeah, as well as, okay, to put everything regarding the objects of interpretations into the same level of ontological status, yeah. We know that, okay, we can find, yeah, in Indonesia context, a lot of narrations, a lot of narratives that quasi-justified by scholars. It legitimated the way we interpreted reality as Indonesians. For example, we can find okay, justified text, for example, from Warsito and so on, saying they have they forecast reality in 2045, for example, yeah, and so on. So what kind of heretics? And we know that when we do heretics, we also encounter lived experience by the people surrounding the projects. Yeah, we know that every interpretation is the compositions or composed by the accumulations of power. As Kim already told me last week, yeah, that okay, when you say that identity and so on, yeah, accumulation of power, because the interpretation itself is included the way or the way of normativity of interpretations. I think it is belongs to methodological, I think, yeah. Every methodology have normativity, but different to the way we can handle Nusantara philosophy, yeah. I think when we put Nusantara philosophy on the high-level normativity of methodology, I think we will face a lot of constraint there because we face gigantic philosophical traditions, Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy that already developed, yeah, well developed. So what kind of methodology? I think that's obscuring our mind. Thank you very much.
I mean, that's a very legitimate concerns that you have expressed. One, of course, is comparative methodology that goes in terms of comparing a variety of texts. And texts are also not just written texts, but they are oral texts. In the case of Nusantara, it's largely oral traditions that needs to be reconceptualized. So it depends on a philosopher who is handling this oral narrative. And in handling the oral narrative, the connections that are there between one oral narrative and the other, it's not just visibly available. You have to make that connection. In order to make that connection between one oral narrative and the other oral narrative, you have to take recourse to certain kind of a technique of interpretation. You have to bring together apparently disparate things and then see how you balance them out in a common framework of interpretation. So these are all exploratory possibilities. And these exploratory possibilities actually make doing philosophy of Nusantara more interesting than doing philosophy which is already available through textualization and through certain modes of theory. So therefore, if you accept this premise that it's entirely new and creative, and a lot of comparisons can be done, there comes this question of hyperobjects, because you come across various kinds of idea of spirits, and you name them. Some of the spirits are connected to certain objects, and some of the spirits are free-floating, and each spirit has its own function. It can make someone well, or it can make someone fall sick as well. It can create abundance, it can create scarcity. So you have this multiple contradictions of life expressed through the functions of the spirits. Now the job of a philosopher would be to collect all these ideas, to collect them together and connect it to the core belief of the community. How do we connect it to the core belief of the community? In the sense of how the community worships those spirits, how the community tries to negotiate with those spirits in the everyday living. How do they make themselves better by negotiating in a certain way? All these practical wisdom aspects in terms of which we deal with the spirit world is something that is creative in itself. We need to really find it out. We have not yet found it out. So therefore, it remains an open and exploratory exercise, more guided by a kind of a sensibility towards what we are trying to study. So that's how it remains very open-ended. And at the same time, it gives rise to new ways of articulating about those hyper-objects that are available in your vicinity. I think this is how we'll look at it. Yeah, please.
Is there any response from Wasim for these answers?
It is very interesting, yes, good to hear from you that, okay, in terms of democratizing things, yeah, that we face a lot of hyper objects here around us, yeah, and I'm not sure that every empty names that refer to the narrations, the narrative in particular area, particular cultural context, and so on, yeah, it also can be positioned as a clearance, as the same as the way scientific observations does, for example. Because in terms of the legitimations of the narrations, yeah, we need to have a clear object that we observe and so on. Yeah. But I think my next question to you, yeah, how can we make sure that the methodology itself can handle or can cover what kind of different things that, okay, maybe when we use some kind of methodology, yeah, we face a lot of normativity and so on and so on, yeah. So what kind of approaching that we need to deploy and so on? Thank you.
I think when you know about critical reflexivity, we have to exercise reflexivity in choosing what we choose and not to choose what we do not choose. And then we have to re-examine what we have found out and try to see whether the consequences that follow from the knowledge of a certain X or a certain hyperobject, we can know the entire consequences. Probably we won't be able to know the entire consequences. Therefore, we won't have omnipotence, in other words. So, minus this possibility of omnipotence, whatever we relatively know there on the ground, it has its own epistemic validity. Epistemic validity in the sense of the practice that it is forced into, or that it forges a certain kind of a practice of interpretation as well, by the observer. So therefore, the observer-observed relationship here is like a learning relationship. The observer learns from the observed, so that what is being observed, that is immersed into the process of observation. So you cannot separate the observer from the observed here, because observer and observed are bound together in a process of immersive understanding and reflexivity. So that is the methodological twist here, which is not there in the positivist sciences. So you have to see that you exercise good enough reflexivity to capture your own subjects. And once that is captured, it is possible to widely interpret that subject in terms of a variety of theories, a variety of texts, and all those, which is open. Like Dipesh Chakrabarty writing about planetary crisis, for example. He is not taking into account specific crisis into view. He is taking some generalizable climate crisis. But here we are taking specific subjects into our account. And specific subjects should lead us to a certain kind of a holistic understanding. But that is not something that can be called immediately planetary or global. We refrain ourselves from calling ourselves as planetary or global, or even universal. So we remain somewhere at a middle level understanding, which is neither too low nor too above, but something that emerges from our capture of our own reality. And that is something very, very important, which goes entirely missing in large number of epistemic theories. That's what will be a kind of a solution.
Thank you, Professor Yusuf. Thank you, Mas Adi, for the question. And I think this the final request for us is for each of you give us closing remarks or final quotes or anything that you can give.
So we can start. Okay. When we talk about intercultural research, intercultural permanence and so on, and indigenous philosophies, we were focusing on diversity, perhaps universality, right? And in that kind of discourse, the dimension of universality is often in the background. It's not foregrounded. Universality is something suspicious. We are used to thinking about universality as something that's Eurocentric and Western-centric, dominated by Eurocentrism. But I want to also suggest, okay, but that doesn't mean that we can get rid of the universal dimension, even when we study diverse cultures and different pluriverses, worldliness. As Alan Badiou put it somewhere, and I think in the theory of the subject, once we abdicate universality, what obtains is universal horror. When we are confronted with planetary crisis of the Anthropocene, it seems that what is just as important as looking at different worldings and indigenous worlds is to to imagine a new dimension of universality. That I think should be a project for intercultural research. Not understanding just one culture, differences between cultures, but rather imagining a way to build up a new universalist project for social transformation. Thank you.
like to say thank you. No, I'm so sorry. So, in the term of in the end of the word philosophy, Nusantara philosophy should be not like waiting for messianistic entity comes and then say, oh, this is Nusantara philosophy or not. So we can start to inform everywhere, starting from anywhere about Nusantara philosophy, starting from the culture, politicals, even though the idea of Nusantara itself. So I believe that when we have more encouraged to rethinking again what the future of Nusantara philosophy, it can be possible to be contributing in a more global philosophy. As well, everything that we discussed before, we try to decide, we try to develop, we try to make new definitions, emerging new directions about Nusantara philosophy. So the current Nusantara philosophy is needed to improve, I guess. So this is our responsibility, as well as the academician and also philosopher here. So you don't need to worry. You don't need to waiting for the message comes to say that, oh, this is Nusantara philosophy. Or maybe he will ask about us that there is no truth in Nusantara philosophy. But what is truth? Is to ask for Nusantara philosophy, for example. So Nusantara philosophy is still possible in many words. Possibilities. We can talk everything, we can make collaborations between the near of the archipelagic thinkings, as well as I also still develop hope. So we can starting also from the archipelagic idea against about some of the idea of the climate catastrophe, for example, or maybe trying to joining in the current contemporary problems today. So the question is again that how is possible to make invisibility of Nusantara philosophy to be more recognized, at least for our Indonesian philosopher and also recognitions in academic communities. It's all for me and Prof. Biswas.
I think this department has a great responsibility to really weave together all these islandic, archipelagic, and site-based philosophies that are available in Indonesia and which are not represented in the mainstream of philosophy as yet. And it extends itself beyond Indonesia. It goes towards the Bay of Africa. It goes towards other indigenous communities of Southeast Asia. And you have this entire terrain which is unrepresented. And that is where we should start to work together and see to what extent we can build up a different kind of philosophy. Of course, in close interaction and dialogue with Western philosophy and other modes of philosophy. It's not to alienate ourselves, but it is to expand the dialogue and to be able to respond to them from our own grounded position. That will be something that we need to do.
I guess that is all the wrap up for today's discussion. Thank you for all of your presentations today, and for the audiences. This is a great opportunity for us to hear about these ideas and thoughts. But before we end this discussion, I guess we can take a picture together.
There is nobody there. Everyone go to break. Lunch. Yeah, break. Mas,